Hello, and welcome to the Maine Question podcast. I'm your host, Ron Lisnett. It's been a minute since our last episode, but we are glad to be back. In this episode, we shine a light on a subject that operates mostly in the shadows. All too frequently, however, it grabs news headlines with serious, even tragic consequences. Our subject today is hazing, a practice that rears its ugly head in groups ranging from athletics teams to musical groups to college campuses among fraternities and sororities. And the stats are pretty eye-opening. The Hazing Prevention Network estimates 1.5 million students, high school students, experience hazing every year. 74% of student athletes experience some form of hazing in college, usually involving alcohol. 55% of college students overall involved in fraternities, sororities, teams, and other organizations experience hazing. And 71% of students who witnessed hazing said alcohol was involved in some way. The problem is indeed large. So how can it be addressed and ultimately reduced or even eliminated? Our guest today is someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about just that. And with that, we say hello to our guest, Elizabeth Allan, who is a professor of higher education and the founder of StopHazing.org, and you're in the College of Education and Human Development. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's taken a while for our schedules to align, yes. So we're excited that finally happened. So many questions and so many things we can talk about. But I'm sort of curious, first of all, how did you get into this? Why follow this path? What was it about hazing that interested you? Said, I want to dig deep into this?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it all started when I was, prior to becoming a researcher, prior to earning my PhD, I was working for a few years at a university in student leadership programs. And that was when I started to hear about hazing. And prior to that, I thought it was something that just happened in fraternities. But the more I got to know students, the more they trusted me, the more we worked together around leadership development. They shared these experiences, and I realized it was happening in many different types of organizations. And at the same time, one of the senior leaders in the division said, have you ever seen this book? A new book is out. It's called Broken Pledges. And it was a book written by Hank Newer, and he's a journalist, and this was a first book that he wrote. He's since written several others on hazing. But in it chronicled the story of Eileen Stevens, whose son was killed in a hazing incident. And anyway, it was a confluence of events of reading this story of her experience, of what happened there, and how it was a kind of tradition that people knew about and just sort of looked the other way. Many folks did, even though it was abusive and dangerous.
Right.
And so I just realized in that time that I wasn't going to be a bystander to this, and I was going to work. And at the same time, I'm working with students who are complaining about it and concerned, mm-hmm. but yet feel like, well, this is just the way it is. This is what I need to do to belong. And I just knew that wasn't right. And so started working with the students to try to figure out what can we do about this. Because at the time, this is in the early 90s, there weren't really there wasn't much of any research done or resources about how to prevent it. So we just kind of
started from square one, right?
Things out,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, that's how it all started.
Right. Well, let's start with the basics. Let's define the term. What exactly is hazing?
Sure. So we define it as any activity expected of someone joining a group, that could be a club, team, organization, or also maintaining membership in that group, that humiliates, degrades, abuses, or endangers them, regardless of their willingness to participate. So that's a mouthful. So we typically break the definition down into 3 components. I mean, because hazing can be defined in different ways depending on, like, is it for a policy? Is it for training or education purposes? Is it in research? But in general, those 3 key components that define hazing are, first, it's about the group context. So it's hazing is specific to joining or maintaining membership in a type of group. That's what differentiates it from bullying, say. So you have the group context, component one. Second, it's not any kind of behavior. It's behavior that is abusive, humiliating, degrading, harmful, or potentially harmful physically or psychologically. And third, that it can happen regardless of a person's willingness to participate. And that third component is really important for folks to understand. It's often tricky because people will say, no, that wasn't hazing, that was that was just an initiation, and we gave people a choice of whether or not to do it, therefore it wasn't hazing. And that's not the case. According to the definition, it can still be hazing. And we typically explain that by talking about that group context combined with an individual's strong desire to belong. I mean, it's a human desire to want to belong. So you have those two coming together to create their ingredients for a potentially coercive environment. And when you have coercion, that impedes a true consent.
Right. Common misperceptions or misconceptions. How prevalent is it, and what are some of the falsehoods about it that are out there?
Sure. So common misconceptions, we hear all the time. Wasn't hazing, it was just some antics, some pranks, some horseplay, just an initiation, just a tradition. So there's a lot of ways in which we hear in our language how it can be minimized or overlooked as something else. And when people do that, I think it reveals a common misconception that it's not that harmful. And so I think it's really important for folks to understand the harm that can come even from things that maybe don't seem, severely physically violent on the surface. There's still harm. There's psychological harm that can leave scars for years to come, for example. So that's one misconception. You asked about, how prevalent is it? In our 2008 national study that I led with Dr. Mary Madden, we found that 55% of college students who belong to clubs, teams, organizations had experienced hazing.
Wow.
Yeah, and we also found they reported that they had about 47 to 48% had experienced it in high school. So before coming to college, students are being exposed to hazing.
Right. So a lot more out there than we would probably think. Can you talk about you've done some work with the military on this, and I was thinking about this. For someone to join the Navy SEALs, they are measured on their toughness and resilience and, dealing with extreme situations in combat or whatever. Is there ever a justification for it at any level in a situation like that or some other situation?
It's a really great question. It's one that I talked with my dad about a lot. He is a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And, so we discussed this question a lot. And I think basically what it comes down to is if you know the definition of hazing, then you don't get it confused with combat readiness. You don't get it confused with training for a mission that is necessary.
It's two different things.
They're two different things. And the Department of Defense issued a report in 2018. They did an extensive study of hazing in the military and talked about, they were unequivocal that hazing, jeopardizes mission readiness, mission accomplishment and unit readiness, and erodes trust within the ranks and compromises cohesion. So they're really clear about hazing doesn't belong here.
Right. So you have worked with the military. What did that work look like?
Yeah, so interestingly, it was my work that, on hazing and its prevention in higher education that drew their attention because we had produced a data-driven framework, the first framework to guide hazing prevention, called the Hazing Prevention Framework. And so they wanted to see how would that framework maybe translate to a military context. As well, they came to, our paths crossed because of data they had collected showing that there was this intersection between hazing and sexual assault. And for soldiers, and men in the military in general, they reported that they were most likely to experience sexual assault in the context of hazing. So the linking of those two together is what we've worked on in a couple of different projects, and specifically with some researchers at Fort Liberty. And so we had a team, and we collected data. We looked at, similar to what I've done in higher education. What's the nature and extent of this? What are the experiences? How likely are people to report it? What are some of the barriers? And so we've been publishing on that data, and then also looking at the translational data to come up with a framework that's really specific or tailored to military contexts.
Right. I know it's not your area, but is there any info out there about the origins of hazing? Is the military part of, going back to wherever, the Middle Ages or something, is that part of where this all sort of germinated from?
Well, that is a great question, and Hank Newer, the colleague I mentioned, who has become a colleague and someone that I've known throughout this journey, who wrote the Broken Pledges, has also looked into the history, and it does date back to potentially
the beginning, right?
Yes,
right.
And because I think really it's at its core, hazing is about power and an abuse of power. And so it's not surprising that we would see it throughout time, and in different forms and called different things. But in the United States, I mean, he's chronicled and kept a website that chronicles deaths related to hazing, and we have sort of documentation of that dating back to the early 1800s. And he's since chronicled, for college students, deaths have surpassed 100 since the year 2000.
Wow.
Yeah, so that surprises a lot of people.
Right. So the timing of recording of this is somewhat fortuitous, because there's a bill that has been passed by Congress and is waiting the president's signature, the Stop Campus Hazing Act, yes, that you were part of. You consulted on that with Congress. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So my involvement in the federal legislation dates back to official involvement. It was 2016 when I was invited to speak to the HELP committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee of the U.S. Senate. And they had a hearing, and I was asked to talk with them about my research and what my thoughts were related to prevention and what was needed. And then after that, I did a few congressional briefings and started working in earnest with families who had lost children in hazing and were forming coalitions. One family in particular, I worked with alongside Cleary Center, the Diversely family. But that group continued to grow, and we worked together to walk the Hill a few years, and just as teams, they would provide their personal stories of tragedy, and I would be able to provide the subject matter expertise as a researcher, and then folks from Cleary Center would talk about the actual Cleary Act and what this amendment would mean for it and for campus professionals to implement it. So that work has really, been in earnest over the past 4 years. And finally, it's led to this point where we're actually seeing it passing both chambers.
That's great. Well, at its core, what does the Act do? I imagine a lot of it is bringing into the sunlight this issue and the data around it. Is that a part of it? What is the Act designed to do? Exactly.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. So, that transparency is a major emphasis and goal of the bill, of the legislation. So, first is the amendment to the Cleary Act would require college campuses, universities to document hazing as part of their annual security reports. They're already required to do these annual security reports because of the Cleary Act, but hazing has never needed to be included until now. So hazing will need to be included as one of those statistics that's reported annually, so any instances or violations of campus incidents of hazing. Second, the law will require campuses to do some kind of education, research-informed education and awareness about hazing for students, for staff, for everyone in the campus community. And so that's big. And then thirdly, it will require them to update a transparency report. So first to develop a transparency report and then update it every 6 months, publish it on their website to document instances of hazing or violations of hazing, and also share what they're doing to prevent hazing and how people can report it. And this is so important because those families that I talked about earlier, and listening to their stories, family after family after family will share that when their child came to them and said, I want to join such and such group, they said, okay, tell me more about it, let's talk. And they did, and they talked about the group having, values of leadership and community service and so forth. And, a number of the families talk about they did their due diligence. They went, they wanted to see more because maybe they were unfamiliar with the group at that campus. And so, one mother, Jolene Houts, who we've worked with and who's a partner with us to build this database called Hazing Info. She was a journalist and had worked for years gathering information. She's an expert at that, and she went to find out more about this fraternity her son was joining and couldn't find anything. But then after he died in a hazing incident and an investigation happened, they found dozens of violations had occurred in this chapter. But it wasn't public knowledge. Right. And she and many other parents believe that if they had had access to that information, that they could have prevented, things would have unfolded completely differently and their children would still be with them today. So that transparency piece is something we've been promoting for years as a best practice for prevention, and then having these powerful stories directly from the families who have experienced tragedy just amplified the need for it.
Right. You put a human face on a story like that, and it really hits home.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. StopHazing.org, that's an organization you founded, and that's sort of obviously a big part of this. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So interestingly, StopHazing.org was just a website when it began. And going back to when I talked about my start in this work, something I didn't mention was that I worked with the students to try to implement a number of prevention strategies. So we created a hotline, we did trainings, we had speakers come to campus, and another thing we did together was get a state law passed, an anti-hazing law. So in the process of doing that, this is it's just right on the cusp of the internet. It's the early 90s. But I gathered a lot of information relative to educating the public about why we needed this law in the state. And so then when I went off to grad school for my doctorate, and I had all this information I wanted to share. And my husband, Brian, was building websites sort of for fun, a side project. And we said, let's put our
these two things together.
Right? And so that's how Stop Hazing came to be. Initially just a website, and now it's grown since doing the national study in 2008. And then a few years after that, working to really build a knowledge base about prevention, we expanded the website to be sort of the public face of the research, and then realized we needed to be able to do more, so we continued to build capacity, and I was able to hire our first employee, Meredith Stewart, a two-time grad of the University of Maine, is our operations manager, and then Dave Kirshner, who's a doctoral student here with me, and has been working with me on this research since 2014, He's now a postdoctoral fellow with Stop Hazing. So we have a few others, a few other staff members. We're a small but mighty team, but we've grown to be the public face of the research, but also research-based resources. So we're connecting research to practice, and through collaboration with many other organizations, really working to keep the momentum going with hazing prevention and provide really high quality research-based tools, strategies, resources, support, coaching.
That's great. Yeah. So most often, I think most folks hear about hazing in relation to fraternities and sororities, and it usually involving alcohol. Yeah. But you're here to tell us it's much more widespread than that? There's a lot of musical groups. It could be any kind of group, right?
That's right. Yes, that was one of the really important findings, and that emerged from the national study in 2008 and has since borne out in a subsequent research data collection that we've continued to do, is that it cuts across many different types of groups. And going into it, we knew it was happening in fraternities and sororities, especially fraternities, and that was shown from the data, and also in athletics. But then I think some surprises we're seeing that it was happening even in some honor societies, performing arts groups, even academic clubs. We knew it was happening, anecdotally we had heard about it happening in club sports, some kinds of like rugby, that's not always a varsity sport,
right.
Ski club, things like that. But we didn't realize it was happening to the extent it is in intramural sports. Really? So there were a number of surprises. And then, at the high school level, it looks different too. There can be class hazing that happens, for example, when new students are coming into a school. It really depends on the context. But yes, it is widespread and occurs in a range of different types of groups.
Now, say if you look at a situation or an instance of this, I mean, you can maybe, in this one particular case, say that looks like hazing, but how does hazing play into that human desire to be part of a group, be part of the in-crowd, be part of the group that's with it? I mean, it fights against that quite a bit, I would imagine.
Yes, so, I mean, that strong desire to belong is one of the reasons why we need that third component of the definition, which is regardless of a person's willingness to participate, because, it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is about power dynamics, and when you have that need to belong, that strong desire, it's a human need. We all want to be part of groups, but and so there can be ways in which that's abused, and that's what happens. And so, and often it's not, like intentionally abusive, or that it's just sometimes it plays out. Well, this is what was done to me. This is what we did last year. This is what we've always done. This is what the alums tell us is a tradition, and so let's keep it going. It can be...
the pressure has to be enormous.
Oh, yes, exactly. I mean, students talk about that. They talk about, well, they endured it because they wanted to get into the organization and then make a change. Once they get in, though, they find it is so difficult to make that change because the forces of keeping it in place, of keeping the status quo are really powerful. Right.
How early or young should kids start learning about this? And are there alternatives that are being put forth to keep the rituals and traditions but not cross the line into abuse?
Definitely. Yes, we're really excited about some of the resources we've developed. One in particular that comes to mind with this question is 10 signs of healthy and unhealthy groups. And that's something that you could introduce very early. I mean, we're talking grade school.
Okay.
We know that hazing is happening. It's been documented in the research as early as middle school. And so we need to get the message out there earlier. And you can send a "we don't haze" message, but we know that that might not be the most effective approach. Instead, we're trying to focus on, the positive behaviors that we want to see, creating those group environments where they're healthy environments, and so you wouldn't have hazing. So what are the skills, what are the behaviors that we want to see in those healthy group environments? We want to see trust, we want to see mutual respect, we want to see honesty. And so this 10 signs approach is something that we worked with an organization called the One Love Foundation, and they have this framework, 10 signs of healthy and unhealthy relationships, because they're an interpersonal violence organization. And so we worked with them to adapt it for group settings. And so now we're using that. We have a toolkit, we do trainings, the train the trainer approach. We have an IRB approved study going on right now. We're collecting data about its effectiveness. And so I think something like that is an example of how we can prevent hazing earlier by just working with young people to talk about, okay, what's the kind of, a group environment that is healthy? And if it's not healthy, there are these toxic signs, what can you do about it?
Right. In this age of smartphones and social media, does that complicate this? Does it make it give a new way to bully or haze someone, or is that just is it one of the tools that's being used to do this?
For sure. I mean, social media is a factor, and we're going to be taking a closer look at that when we relaunch. We're going to do a relaunch of the national study next year.
Okay.
And so, so much has changed since 2008, and so we want to know more specifics about the social media impact. But we know anecdotally that it's a factor. It can be in so many different ways. I mean, hazing can take so many forms. It just depends on the context. I mean, sometimes it's about taking people's phones away in order to isolate them. Sometimes it's about using the phones and social media to humiliate or degrade someone. It really depends. So it's just how it's employed.
Yeah. What kind of work is going on here at the university? I know you have at least one doctoral student, but is this topic being studied in the College of Education and Human Development?
Yes, there are a number of students. We have graduate students who are working on this with me, and I've collaborated with colleagues, to bring in their expertise and do some studies and research. Dr. Gillen and Dr. Huckala, my colleagues in higher education, have both contributed to the research and the literature, and we have student interns, graduate student interns here, but also from colleges and universities throughout the country. So we can do that now, especially since people are so accustomed to using distance technology. So we're regularly collaborating with colleagues from here and around the country, and students as well. Right.
Well, we could go on for hours about this, but it's just fascinating work, and kudos to you for doing it. And so the new survey is going to begin this week. People who are interested in this should watch for that coming up in 2025.
Yes, we'll be piloting in 2025, and then expect to do the full launch in 2026.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks as always for checking us out. You can find all of our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud, UMaine's YouTube page, as well as Amazon Music. Questions or comments? Send them along to Maine Question at maine.edu. This is Ron Lisnett. We'll catch you next time on the Maine Question.